I know this is getting tedious, but I want to point out that slavery is right in the New York Times today. I'm not talking about contemporary slavery, slavery before the Civil War. I'm not talking about 12 Years a Slave winning the Academy Award, which is good. I'm talking about an article here on, page A18, today's paper, about a statue. Frankly, I never saw it. I don't remember this statue. In Central Park at 103rd Street, there is a statue of, what is his name? Dr. Sims. what is his first name? I don't know. A doctor from the 19th century, James M. Sims. Okay? There's a lot of statues. And why is this controversial? Some people want the statue removed. Well, Dr. Sims was a pioneer of modern gynecology. He pioneered treatment of women for gynecological problems and was therefore considered a very important medical practitioner. The only problem, it says, he developed a procedure to treat these things. What was left unsaid, it's certainly not at the monument, is this. His experiments were done on slave women without their consent and without anesthesia. In other words, he was living in the South, but he eventually moved to New York. But he was living in the South, and he did medical experiments on slave women. And some people don't think he's worthy of a statue. Remember I talked about Denmark Vesey's statue? Well, the statues become controversial points here. So this is Dr. Sims, and there's a movement to remove his statue, or, well, maybe not remove it, maybe change what is said on it to be a little more accurate about the pros and cons of his career. A woman who wrote about him said, well, some people see him as a hero, some people see him as a monster. The problem is he was both. He achieved something important, but look at how he did it. Her answer, which I don't think is so bad, is to leave the monument but put up a memorial to the women who were victims of Dr. Sims. So this is the consequences of the practice of slavery as a controversy in our time right today. So it's history as a way of just coming up in the present. I guess we'll just put it that way. All right, we're going to go back then 150 years, and we left off with the firing on Fort Sumter and the beginning of the Civil War. And as is probably predictable, the result of that, after months of crisis, the actual outbreak of fighting, although in a very, very small place, kind of clarified people's thoughts and galvanized or focused public opinion. Both North and South, there was this kind of rush of men to enlist in the army, go out and fight. Initially, a kind of what seemed to be a unanimity of sentiment. Certainly in the North, Stephen A. Douglas rushed to the White House to pledge the support of Northern Democrats to the Lincoln administration in trying to, preserve the Union. Douglas then, not long afterwards, on June 3rd, 1861, Douglas died rather early. He was still a man in his 40s. And this was, we will talk down the road about internal dissent, both North and South, but certainly no political leader replaced Stephen A. Douglas as the, acknowledged single leader of the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party in the North begins to splinter, and there's nobody who can be a spokesman the way Douglas could have. So in a certain sense, from Lincoln's point of view, it's very unfortunate that Douglas died, because he was a link into the Democratic Party. But anyway, this moment of unanimity lasts for a while, and then it disintegrates, as often happens in war, as casualties increase and people begin to wonder about it. But certainly at this point, there's, as I say, Sidney George Fisher, a lawyer in Philadelphia, a sort of conservative Republican, that we often quote his diary. He kept a very extensive diary of his observations about what was going on during the Civil War. And he writes on April 15th, excuse me, "No doubt Fort Sumter is taken, and its surrender has roused the war passions of the North to a fearful pitch. From all quarters come accounts that the people are arming. The danger now is they will go too far. The South has sowed the wind and is likely to reap the whirlwind. The next day, he writes that he's in Philadelphia, all the houses and stores are displaying American flags. Even the abolitionists who kind of rushed to support the Lincoln administration. Now remember, the Garrisonian abolitionists, a small group but very vocal, had actually advocated disunion before the Civil War. They had advocated the North separating itself from the South. Why? Because A, they said the Constitution is a pro-slavery document. We do not want to live under this Constitution. And B, it would separate the North from complicity in slavery, and it would weaken the institution of slavery by not having the federal government protecting it. But whatever, this was not a popular view in the North, but that was their doctrinal view. Now, in the aftermath of Fort Sumter, they basically abandoned that completely. And Wendell Phillips, the great orator, the Garrisonian orator, gives a big speech in Boston calling on abolitionists to rally around the flag and to support the war effort to maintain the Union, which they had thought ought to be broken up. In other words, this was a complete abandonment of their previous doctrine, and it's a little harbinger of something we will see down the road of how Northern reformers, intellectuals, and others kind of all come increasingly in the war to identify with the national state, rather than seeing it as hostile or maintaining a kind of separation from it. They now sign on as cheerleaders for the national state. Phillips, a very prescient guy, urges emancipation. The war has opened the door to emancipation. This is April 1861. Why? The war power of the president. This is a phrase we'll hear a lot of, but Phillips puts it out there. He says something to the effect, the bones of John Quincy Adams are rattling in his grave. Why? Because in the 1840s, John Quincy Adams in Congress had warned that in the event of a war, the war power of the president that is commander-in-chief of the army, gives him the power to emancipate slaves as a war measure. And by the way, this was totally known. There was no secret about this. Southerners knew it themselves. Southerners who were opposed to secession said this is a danger. The American Revolution, the War of 1812, the Indian Wars, the Wars of the Caribbean, in every single one of those wars, one side or another had offered freedom to the slaves of their opponents. It's a way to weaken the other side. The British had done this, et cetera, et cetera. The French did it to Spanish slaves. The British did it to French slaves. It was a known thing, and Phillips saying, we can do this right now. Just declare the slaves free. Well, it doesn't come right away, but in a sense, he's opening up the agenda, which will become more and more important as the war goes on. But at this point, there are very few in the North saying that. Even the New York Tribune, a pretty radical anti-slavery newspaper, says no, they repudiate him. They say this is a war for the preservation of the Union, not for the destruction of slavery. It would alienate many ardent Unionists to pervert it into a war against slavery. We believe, said Horace Greeley, the editor, slavery has nothing to fear from a Union triumph, okay? That's April 1861. Well, with the firing on Fort Sumter, Lincoln issues a call. He declares there is an insurrection in the country, which the federal government must put down, and he calls for 75,000 volunteers to join up with the Union Army, which is only about 18,000 men, the regular army at that time. 75,000 volunteers to serve for 3 months. This shows you what they thought of the war at the beginning. 3 months, the war will be over. 75,000 volunteers for 3 months, okay? And he proclaims a blockade of the southern ports. Now, Lincoln is a very good lawyer, but he's also a politician and other things, and he knows that that is a completely illegal act in international law. For a country to block, in a sense, it recognizes the Confederacy as a separate nation. In international law, you cannot blockade your own coast. You can only, in a war, you can only blockade somebody else's ports. So by proclaiming a blockade, in a sense, Lincoln is acknowledging the Confederacy at least as a belligerent power, not just an insurrection, maybe not an independent country, but it's not just an act of a few criminals, it's a war of two belligerent powers. But the war, this has always been, complicated during the Civil War, as we'll see. What is the actual status of the Confederacy? Anyway, Lincoln's call for troops leads 4 more states to secede. Remember, there had been 7. Now, if we look at our map here, which is not the most useful, but it's North Carolina, Virginia, Tennessee, and Arkansas, the top pink ones there, secede in the aftermath of the call for troops. In other words, it is the beginning of the war which finally unifies the South, or at least most of the South. It's the war itself that leads this middle South to say its connections are more with the lower. In other words, here's where slavery becomes the bond of unity. And those 4 states, with Virginia being the most important, of course, secede now from the Union. And of course, Virginia's secession brings the Confederacy right up to Washington, D.C., right up to the, right just across the river there from the nation's capital, and makes the possible seizure of Washington, D.C. A danger. And very early, Lincoln calls for troops to be sent to Washington to defend Washington, D.C. And the first casualties of the Civil War, perhaps, are 3 days after the surrender of Fort Sumter, when troops from Massachusetts are passing through Baltimore, Maryland, a slave state, and a mob attacks them. Because the way the train, even though you could go from New York to Washington or Boston by train, because there were various rail monopolies along the way, you actually had to change stations. Like, so in Baltimore, you had to change, to travel through, you had to get off and go to another station to get on another train, because one line controlled one part of the route and another line controlled another part of the route. Anyway, as the troops are marching through Baltimore just to get from one train station to another, a mob attacks them and several of them are killed. And some people might say those are the first casualties of the Civil War. Sidney George Fisher then writes about the reaction to that. He says, "It is not easy to describe the feeling this news produced in Philadelphia. Everyone I saw, with the exception of 2 or 3 Democrats, is filled with rage and resentment. The cry is for a war of extermination on the South. It is declared that Baltimore will be burned to the ground if it attempts to resist the passage of troops." So there's a lot of anger there. A few days later, as more troops pass through Philadelphia on their way to Washington, he also writes, "The finest troops coming through here are from New England, as might be expected, as there the Saxon blood is most pure, and civilization, as a consequence, is the highest." So this is the kind of 19th century racialism, which was not uncommon all over the place.